historian of religion in early America, our guest is the Reverend Priscilla Wood Neves, Distinguished Professor of Religion and Politics and Professor of History at Washington University in St. Louis. His PhD is from Princeton University, and he has held long-term fellowships at the American Antiquarian Society and the Huntington Library. He is the author of Heavenly Merchandise, Art, Religion, How Religion Shaped Commerce in Puritan America, and The Opening of the Protestant Mind, How Anglo-American Protestants Embrace Religious Liberty. And that is published by Oxford University Press, and it's available at our local Northshire bookstore. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Mark Valeri.
Thank you for that. Thank you for being here. And talking about religious liberty these days is no easy thing. It is a concept that is under assault from many quarters. On the right wing of the political spectrum, from the rise of Christian nationalism in the sense that this is a Christian country, we ought to be embracing that and kind of pushing aside other religious traditions, or from the far left of the political spectrum, to be even-handed here, people who are interested in identity politics and thinking that the notion of religious liberty is an Enlightenment, Western, Eurocentric value that we often impose on different traditions. I'm a great believer that the way we untangle knots like this is by doing historical work, and by, in this case, looking at the historical origins, not of the idea of religious liberty, but how it became socially and politically valued in the Anglo-American Protestant world from 1650 through about 1770, or what you would think of as the period of English colonization of the American Eastern Seaboard, and during a time in which especially there's encounters between Anglo people and indigenous Americans. The indigenous Americans of this community, of course, were Mohican and Western Abenaki. So I'm going to use generic term indigenous Americans throughout when I talk about that, but we should keep in mind that Western Abenaki and Mohican are the people groups in this area that would have been involved in that. Before I jump into the outline of the talk, though, as I was sitting there, as you were coming in, I was musing on these two fantastic pictures on the title page, and they come from a the most elaborate large dictionary of religions of the world that was published in the 18th century. Beginning in 1653, there's a burst of literature on the religions of the world, which is really fascinating to think of these people in Boston or London or Philadelphia beginning to get their minds around the fact that they're now being networked through commerce and through colonization in a global setting. That means they're encountering different religions, and they're really interested in what different religions have to teach and say and interactions with them. So this comes out of a book published in 1733, and there's two very different scenes portrayed, but they have a likeness. On the left side is a portrait of a 1712 ceremony in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And it is a ceremony for the canonization of 5 new saints in the Roman Catholic Church, when people who have been dead for a while are exalted into the sainthood status. And it sort of portrays the awesomeness, the grandeur, and if you will, the power of Roman Catholicism. Look at the size of the people in relation to the building, the basilica, and sitting right there in the middle of the picture, underneath the drop ceiling, is the Pope himself. You'll notice on the right-hand picture is quite a different scene from the artist Bernard Picart. He was the engraver of this volume. What he imagined to be a ceremony in a Buddhist temple in Japan. So you can see it's a totally different setting, but there's something very similar about the whole scene. The divine figure sits in the middle, underneath a dropped canopy, and there are statues along the side, different deities in the Buddhist pantheon on the side of the walls of the Buddhist temple, just like on the sides of the walls of St. Peter's are statues of saints, the people relatively small in the middle of it, and the right differs from the left chiefly in that it has fire, you see on the left. And for these 18th century people, fire was always a bad thing. When you saw a fire in a religious ceremony, it was really an image for something bad going on. Ecstatic, dangerous, trying to get people away from divine thoughts into emotional, physically oriented experience. But otherwise, and this is my point of putting this on the cover, is that Picart clearly was imagining what a Buddhist temple looked like from his image of what goes on in Rome. He shapes Japanese Buddhism to look like what he imagines to be Roman Catholicism. And one of my points is that when different religions begin to become described by Anglo-Protestant people in this period, they draw upon what they know and project that onto the world. And so the religious conflicts that they figure is projected on the world. And the same is true for their projecting upon indigenous American religions. When I began investigating this, I was actually interested in the notion of conversion, and whether in the 1730s and 40s there was a lot of conversion talk in the American colonies. You may have heard the Great Awakening, the revivals of the period, sort of upswelling of religious fervor and a lot of people being converted. And I thought, well, did they think of conversion as conversion into another religion as well, adopting another religious tradition? That's how this project began. And when I started looking at that, I began noticing all these dictionaries and all these travel accounts, ambassador reports, merchants' letters back home, which are describing other religions and people shifting their religious allegiance, converting from one tradition to another. So I began reading this literature, and I had assumed the standard interpretation, which I received through my graduate training and all my colleagues were embracing, which goes something like this. Anglo-American Protestants were very inward-looking provincial people who thought they were the best thing in the world, and that all other traditions were inferior and all other religions were savage and false, and they scripted onto that racial categories, they scripted onto it nationalist categories, they scripted onto it all sorts of different ways of reading the other and othering those people and putting British Protestants on top of that. And that goes even across when America becomes independent, the standard interpretation, American treatment of indigenous peoples does indeed in the 19th century become very tinged with the sense of civilization versus savagery, whiteness versus non-whiteness, democratic versus autocratic. There's all these categories lumped on top of each other, educated versus uneducated, etc. And that went all the way through this whole colonial period. But what shocked me and surprised me, shocked is a bit too strong, which surprised me, is that there's a big change in around the turn of the 18th century in the way Protestants described other religious traditions. And that, I think, is the key to the reason that religious liberty becomes not just an abstract philosophical ideal never applied, but actually real political and social axiom, a thing to be lived out and lived into with one's relationships with people around them. How is it that you think religious liberty is an ideal, which we read in John Locke and the political philosophical textbooks? How does it come down to the way we actually treat people of different religions? If you think those other religions are inherently, essentially dangerous, then you're not so open to the notion of religious liberty. But if you think that there's something about different religious traditions to embrace and affirm on a common experiential level, then you're more likely to accept that principle and value it and cherish it and hold on to it. So this little historical discussion goes into that. Let me illustrate to you what I mean by the change that I detected. This is the first great book of world religions published in English by Alexander Ross in 1653. The first word on the title is the Greek pansabia, pan, all, sabia, forms of devotion, all forms of devotion. Ross was a chaplain to Charles I, and this is what Ross said in this book. There's a 1696 edition here because I couldn't find a good copy of the first 1653 edition. But there's Ross, and this is what he says. We all know that each country, nation, has a political identity and a religious identity, and they're bound together. No good kingdom goes without saying, we are this religiously. England, of course, in Ross's view, is Protestant. So to be English is to be Protestant, to be a faithful, loyal English person is to be Protestant, and therefore all other religions are not only spiritually suspect, but they're politically seditious. To be English is to be Protestant, therefore to be non-Protestant is to be disloyal to England. And Ross especially went at this when he talked about indigenous American traditions. He saw all indigenous American traditions from Canada down to Mexico as all the same thing, just a bundle of savagery and brutality, inhumanity, ignorance, superstition, and every time he goes all throughout from Canada down to Mexico, it's all the same. It's all bad. And what he's in essence is saying is, I want none of the British colonists in America to think highly of indigenous American traditions because it will make you a disloyal English person. So he read Native American traditions through his political sentiments. The change I'll represent in one big jump is from that to the second great dictionary of religions published by an English person. This is by Thomas Broughton, who is a nerdy little scholarly rector in Huntingdonshire, England, very learned. He translated Handel's librettos into English and was that kind of person. But he also accumulated this dictionary of all religions in the world. And you'll notice by a quick look at the title page that he doesn't define religions by nations. This is the religion of France, Paraguay, England, Germany. He says this is sort of all religion extracted and divided into different kinds of practices. It's though religions aren't defined by their national boundaries. It's defined by the kind of practices that they encourage and promote. And this is the frontispiece. That's the big picture at the front of a book that gives you the theme of the book. This is the frontispiece to Broughton's dictionary. And if I can read it for you quickly, a little bit of art history, a little bit of art exposition here. The upper left is a pedestal on which is perched the golden calf of Exodus. In other words, idolatry. And that calf forms the upper third of the tableau, and those buildings behind it are buildings that represent forms of idolatry. There's a Roman Catholic cathedral just to the right of the column, and to the right of that is an Islamic mosque, and to the right of that, an Egyptian period, a pyramid, and to the right of that, an ancient classical temple with devotees bringing their sacrifices. So all of that, if you will, is illegitimate religion in which power and politics are bound together, especially as represented in monumental buildings. That's idolatry. The bottom third of the tableau shows, by which I mean here is his fanciful portrait of what we would call today Hinduism, a Hindu ascetic. The word Hindu was sort of made up by British anthropologists in the 19th century to kind of describe everything that goes on in South Asia or India. So when I use the word Hindu throughout this talk in India, I realize that this is using 19th century British anthropological terms. But the middle of the tableau has his three heroes, if you will. To the left is, and you know who that is on the left. Who's that? Moses holding the tablet of the commandments. And then to the right of him is Mary with the devout countenance holding the communion cup in her right hand and meditating upon the cross. Beneath her feet are the bad figures of the Roman Catholic Church, who she's sort of stomping on. That's a papal tiara right there, and that's images for evil-looking monks. And to the right of that is one of the three heroes is Ali, the founder of the Shiite school of Islam. Here's the name Ali. He's got a copy of the Quran. And what he's saying is if a religion moves towards sound moral teaching and pure devotion, the commandments, the meditation on the cross, even the Quran, if the religion moves in that direction, it is laudable and good and legitimate for English people to consider. So Broughton represents a different view from Ross. Ross, everything out there outside of English Protestantism, or I suppose Dutch Protestantism, but outside of that is not very admirable, is illegitimate, whereas Broughton's view is, no, there are different traditions within different versions of a religion. The mosque at the top is, if you will, power-hungry versions of Islam, and Ali represents morally acceptable, admirable forms of Islam. So how did this shift come about? Typical explanation is that some English people began to become secular. In becoming secular, they critiqued all forms of dogmatism, all forms of creedalism, beliefs in creeds, and once they did that, they were able to say all religions are, if you will, equally subjective and illegitimate. I don't think that's the story I want to tell. There's some truth to that in some quarters, but Thomas Broughton was a very pious Protestant, as are most of the people I'm going to talk about. I think the key to the shift has to do with politics, and the politics that goes on in London at the time. So let me go back to the period of Ross. So we're thinking now the Restoration period, beginning with the English Civil Wars from 1642 to 1652. England is in the midst of a civil war. Parliamentary armies and royal armies are roving throughout the country, having battles, riots in cities. There is a sense of violence, of danger. England is almost, the kingdom is almost destroyed in this. 1649, Charles I is executed. Parliament rules for a while. I know we're recalling our high school history here or college history here. Charles is executed in 1649. Parliament rules, and it is an incredibly chaotic period for England. People are worried about England. And even when the monarchy is restored, that's why it's called the Restoration period in 1660, when Charles II is brought back by Parliament to assume the throne. Even in that period, all these writers look back to the Civil War periods as a horrible period for England. Nathaniel Crouch writes The Strange and Prodigious Religions, Custom, and Manners of Sundry Nations in 1683. He's not like a distinguished figure as is Ross. He is a popular writer who writes cheap books we call chap books. He steals things. There's no copyright laws back then. He steals things from all over and mashes them together where pious heroes are always contrasted with wicked villains for England. And they're juicy stories. They're big sellers. They're sold in little stalls in the streets of London. He was a favorite writer for Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin collected a copy of every single book that Nathaniel Crouch wrote. And he loved it because it was just juicy. You can just see Franklin laughing as he read some of this stuff. But this is his picture of the manner of the ancient Virginians, by which he means the indigenous people of Virginia, by which he means the Algonquian speaking peoples of the Virginia Tidewater, in their worship of idols. Central figure on top of the idol, what's that figure? The devil. So to the left of the devil is the golden calf, and the left of that, the smallest pedestal, has the Egyptian snake on it. What he's saying, and then there's a fire, always a bad sign, right? And people dancing around the fire. And Ross had described indigenous American traditions always as they dance around the fire and they throw, this is not me, this is Ross, deer's blood and tobacco on stone altars. So Crouch, cribbing from Ross, produces this popular book, and in the chapter on indigenous Americans' tradition, he has a picture of them being idols. But what strikes you as odd about that picture? Say that again? Yes. Yeah. What else strikes you? Yes, that's very good. What else strikes you as odd about this?
What they were wearing.
Exactly. What are they wearing?
Well, they're very English look. And then it like walked the spectators.
It's perfect. He dresses them as English people, and he pictures even an English town on the left side, about 2/3 of the way towards the top. He's talking about England. He's very disinterested in the Algonquian peoples of the Virginia Tidewater. What he's saying is, don't let us English people become as disorderly and as violent. Because during the Civil Wars, because during the English Civil Wars, not only were there roaming armies of parliamentary forces versus royal forces, but there were little sectarian groups. When Parliament took control, it sort of took power, it lost control over the religious scene in England. And as a result of that, there were a proliferation, all sort of sectarian movements, different religious groups, Muggletonians, the Fifth Monarchists, as well as crypto-Catholic groups springing up all over. They lost control and allowed all these different religious traditions. And Ross does not want England to do that. Crouch does not want England to do that either. Don't become like that, you English people. So he's giving a statement about indigenous American traditions, but the perspective of his own reading of England's history. So that there are writers from this period, you've heard of Thomas Hobbes, or of lesser figures such as William Temple, who's the English ambassador to the Netherlands during the 1650s. And they write this in a theoretical sense. For England to hold together, it must have a single religion, a single religious confession, they call it. If we allow proliferation of different religions, people fight with each other, right? That's the trouble with allowing religious pluralism, is people come into common spaces with different ideas and therefore won't agree and will soon just take up arms and settle their differences on the field of battle. Well, the thing to do is have the sovereign decree a single religious tradition as the religion of the realm. England is Protestant, preferably Church of England Protestant, but you can be any sort of modest, reasonable Protestant. Presbyterian, okay. Independent, which is the old name for Congregationalist, sure. As long as you're Dutch Reformed, why not? But you can't be a Muggletonian or a fifth monarchist or even at this time a Quaker. You can't be that because that falls outside of acceptable religious traditions. So that was the theory of people like Hobbes and Temple, that only moderate Protestantism should be the glue that holds England together. So this is by John Ogilvy, and I'm about to get out of the bad period in just a minute, so relax. Ogilvy was the royal cartographer, map maker for Charles II, so he's good with a pen, and he publishes a big book on the cultures of the world, and this is his image of what goes on in a temple from northern India. All these different deities on the walls, different groups of people worshiping in different ways. What's here that looks very ominous? Fire, a bad idea, right? So fire, and then people dressed in Persian garb, in Indian garb, and the obelisk in the middle is a funny thing. It took me a long time to track it down. I finally went to the Ashmolean Museum in London to talk to Milandra Kundras, who's the curator of South Asian art there. I said, what is this? And she says, I have no idea. So that she did some work for me. She said, well, it's probably, these sort of obelisks were put up by Muslim rulers. So the northern part of today's India was part of the Mughal Empire in this period. So it was officially Muslim. And she said, it may be an indication of some sort of Islam going on here as well. But this is the point. Ogilvy writes, this is a really bad idea to have all these religions going on at the same place at the same time. It creates disorder. And to prove it, he points out that there are revolts against the Mughal leaders in India at this very time. So they're allowing religious proliferation and pluralism has created political disorder. So politically speaking, you can see why you want a confessional state. So what changes? Well, you probably know the history. In 1688. Charles II is followed by James II, but at the end, in the middle of James's reign, there becomes a parliamentary resistance to James for his autocratic, self-aggrandizing ideas, and Parliament revolts and invites William of Orange, who is collaterally related from the Netherlands, to become the King of England. William does not speak English. He is married to an English person named Mary, who does speak English. So people often call it the reign of William and Mary, because she did all the translating for William at the beginning. But it was a constitutional monarchy. And when William came to the throne, he had a cadre of polemicists, writers, apologists, saying, you, Parliament, number one, ought to really support William because he will never encroach on your religious traditions. You can be, they're by this time, they're Presbyterian Congregationalist members of Parliament, and he basically, William's crew say to Parliament, support him. He's not into oppression. He's into liberty. And liberty becomes the watchword, becomes connected to both religion and to parliamentary politics. Liberty becomes the watchword. William's the defender of liberty, but it's to gain him support, not only in England, but in colonies that are not populated by Church of England people very much, such as Massachusetts and Pennsylvania and Barbados, which is largely populated by Quakers at the time. He also forms alliances with Spain and Austria, which are Catholic states. And he has in his army, his personal army from the Netherlands, a lot of Catholic army officers. And he promises not to persecute Catholics in England as long as they stay quiet. You can't be officially, outwardly, publicly pro-Catholic, because at the time the Pope has said that William III is an illegitimate ruler, and no Catholic should be able to, should be obedient to William. But so William's point is, I will allow liberty even to Catholics, so Catholics should like my rule. And not only that, but there's the beginning of the sense that Catholicism is much different and more variegated than English people once thought of it. I have this great journal from a guy named John Stoddard, who is a Bostonian fella, who is commissioned by Massachusetts to go to Quebec and bring back English children and families who've been captured by the French in the Queen Mary's War, I think is what it's called. One of those Anglo-French wars from the period. So Stoddard goes up there and he writes all these letters back and he says, I met all these Mohawk people and these Roman Catholic people, and you wouldn't believe it, they're really nice. He uses different language, but I'm putting across, I think, pretty true to his point. He says the Mohawk people have protected young English children from starvation, from deprivation, from cold. They're very good to us. And the governor of Canada is a faithful Roman Catholic, but he's really a nice person and has allowed religious liberty here. And all these Catholics aren't bad. The Jesuits, they're bad. And he does write about Jesuit priests sort of sneaking around trying to steal children and things like that. Well, you can see that the politics is beginning to change. And to push the politics forward a little further, from the 1710s to the 1730s, there's a new monarchy established, the Hanoverian monarchy, George I and George II, and England turns its politics towards overseas empire, big overseas empire, the imperial project. The party that supports the Hanoverians, who had also supported William, are called the Whig Party. And the Whigs and the Hanoverians project the sense that trade is the strength of the kingdom. The cosmopolitan, pluralistic nature of England's empire is its strength. So trade with, amongst other areas, the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean. Today we would think of Turkey and Syria and Lebanon. There was a wife to an English official who is sent into the Ottoman Empire to establish trade relationships, and that woman is called Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. And Lady Mary Wortley Montagu writes letters back and she says, I've had these fascinating conversations with Muslim clerics, teachers in Belgrade and Constantinople. And they're awesome. We chatted back and forth. We share so much. We have a similar view of morality and reason. Think back to Broughton's picture of Ali. There's a sense in which things are opening up by personal account. So there's a new theory of patriotism that comes up in this period, that patriotism exists not in a single religious tradition, but in a solidarity with common subjects, not based on a confession, but based on what we might think of as Whig morality. This is a phrase used by historians. The most popular journal from the period, The Independent Whig, by Thomas Gordon and John Trenchard, sort of promulgated this view as a serial. It was like a magazine that came out once every couple months with essays, very popular, read on both sides of the Atlantic. And what it says is, this is what will hold England together. Not a particular creed or confession, but three things. Sensibility, which means regard for your fellow citizen and especially toleration of their different religious tradition. Moral reasonableness, the ability to have discussions together based on common notions of reasonableness and come to common solutions based on that. And also involved in moral reasonableness is the quality of self-critique. Being able to critique one's own position strongly is part of this Protestant Whiggish view. Also utility, being economically useful. So the way to think about religions, say Gordon and Trenchard, is they're not legitimate or illegitimate based on what they teach about God, salvation, those spiritual matters. They're legitimate or illegitimate based on what they teach people, how they teach people to be sensible and reasonable and useful. The enemy to all of this, the enemy to the British Empire, the enemy to this cosmopolitan regime that's spreading liberty throughout the world is faction, what they call partisan rage. Sort of reminds me of today's political scene, right? Faction, not being able to have these conversations. Well, the most faction-like, enraged people in England at this period are the so-called Jacobites. Latin word for James is Jacobus. A Jacobite liked James II, the one who was deposed by William's supporters. James II was a crypto-hidden Catholic. To be a Jacobite was to want England to return to the Stuart monarchy, James, but also to be sympathetic towards Catholicism. There are hidden discussions between Jacobite members of Parliament and French officials to bring a French army over to England to depose George I and George II and install one of the Stuarts. There are also members of the Church of England called Tories, high ceremonial, just like Catholicism has high ceremony, so Tory members of the Church of England liked high ceremony, and they thought that this toleration stuff was just apostasy. It was just religiously a really bad idea. So Tories and Jacobites were factionalists, and so Gordon and Trenchard come out with this idea. If a religion is big on high ceremony and is big on collusion with political powers, that will destroy England, will break it apart. So what you want is a religious tradition that's kind of lower on the ceremony, much bigger on moral teaching, and much less into the ecstasies that ceremony brings. Let's take Islam. So remember, the English political scene is the lens through which all religions of the world are read. There is this dictionary I began with. This is the picture, again, 1733, the picture of the Kaaba in Mecca, the central worship site for Sunni Ottoman Islam. The Ottomans control Saudi Arabia at this time. And that is to evoke fear. That is to evoke a power That is an Islam in which priests, so-called priests or imams, have colluded with political authorities to produce a dangerous state. But not all Islam, because this is another version of Islam in Bernard and Picart's book. Picart's a mufti, a teacher, admirable, probably Shia as opposed to Sunni, Persian, and this picture was famous at the time for being, you'd sort of fall in love with this guy. You know, who wouldn't want to listen to him teach? And it's in a private setting, it's not this big public square. So that's the way they're portraying Islam, is a mixture. And now we get to some Native American portraits. This is one portrait of the central square in today's Mexico City. And notice, like the Kaaba picture, it's this big public courtyard with really small people and a big dominating religious structure in the middle of it, just like the Kaaba. And that is the tower as Picart imagined it in the middle of today's Mexico City. And what goes on in the very top, of course, he shows images up close, I won't show them to you, of human sacrifice. Aztec religion is a combination of priestcraft and power and violence bound up together. But that's not all Native American traditions. This is Picart's image of what he calls the god of the winds. No one knows where he got that. It's a picture of Powhatan, again, the eastern shore of Virginia. But it's a private setting. It's a devotional figure. The god of the winds sounds pretty nice to me. And the sense in this hut in the woods is this acceptable, legitimate form of devotion. One final picture, and then I'll wind things up. This is the frontispiece to Bernard and Picart's volume, The Ceremonies and Religious Customs of the World. And you'll see again 3 different layers. The top layer are all the religious traditions that might seem very, very far away. Peruvian upper left with that sort of stone structure on the left, and above that with the deer on top of the pole is the Sami people, a picture of what we might think of as Lapland. We're not supposed to call it Lapland anymore, the Sami people. And then to the right of that, you'll see the temple from the central square in Mexico City. And up on the right, you have one of those things, spirally columns, and a statue of Hindu gods, and then to the right, the pagodas of Buddhist tradition. Those are in the background. He's not giving us a close reading. What he's saying is, read those through the bottom 2/3 of the picture. The bottom third shows Islam. On the left side, that, if you will, is learned, respectable, scholarly, polite, that would be their word, forms of Islam. But on the right, you have people burning in hell, and a camel who's going to be sacrificed. The garland around the camel's neck means he's being ready to be sacrificed. That is sort of bad, violent forms of Islam. But in the middle is the real story. The left, the woman in the right robe, the lighting, your eyes should go to her first. She's holding a copy of the Bible. To our left of her are heroes of the Protestant faith, Luther, Calvin, Menno Simons. But she's holding the Bible, but a Franciscan priest is trying to close the Bible on her. And to the right are French Catholics fighting with each other. Some of them are called Jansenists, they're kind of Protestant-y Catholics in the way they think and read, and they're being assaulted by papal bishops. So the whole world is read through this lens. Final word then about indigenous Americans. When Protestant missionaries in New England we'll just stick to New England for now, go out to share Christianity with Native American peoples. Back in the 1650s, when there was this other very political reasons to be very strict and harsh, the missionaries were strict and harsh. You couldn't be with them unless, and you couldn't be called a good Christian unless you spoke English, dressed English, stopped hunting and started farming, and gave up all your ceremonies. In the 1750s, missionary activity is very different. Missionaries go and live amongst indigenous peoples. They do not demand that indigenous peoples give up their ceremonies, their burial ceremonies, their marriage ceremonies, their coming of age ceremonies. Fine. We want to talk to you about Jesus, but we want to talk to you about Jesus in ways that we can commonly understand. And because we respect your moral conscience, you too have a very good moral conscience. And we can begin to have conversations. So the notion of persuasion overtakes this coercive missionary practice of the earlier period. Few concluding words. The ideas of religious liberty changed through this period. There is no singular Protestantism tradition. There is no singular nexus of race, empire, bigotry, religion. It changes by political circumstance and by knowing people up close. One final thing is I think we need to reconsider the notion of religious liberty. I think we need to think about it more deeply. My personal sense is notions of sensibility, toleration, reasonableness are really, really good values. Even though they come from the Western Enlightenment tradition, I think they're much need for today. So I'll stop there and open it up for questions. Or comments, or disagreements. Yes? Oh.
Your lecture just feels so fluid. Sort of these waves, and I'm trying to understand how, sort of the pressure points, are they just power and politics, and is it all men that are driving these changes, or is it, women too, or, it just feels really fluid, and I feel like we're going through another era of very fluid perspectives on religion, and so I'm just trying to understand what human beings, what we do, why we do it.
First, on women, I did mention Mary Wortley Montagu. There are the first author of a dictionary of the world's religions after the Declaration of Independence was by a woman. Boy, her name just dropped out of my head. Who's got a copy of my book? I'm so embarrassed. I tried to put women there as much as I could in here. I've just blown it right at the... So, sorry for this, but it's right at the beginning of the epilogue. Hannah Adams. Anybody heard that name before? You can read about her.
Where's she from?
Boston area, not exactly Boston, but outside of Boston. She was a literary figure, lived through the Revolution, began to write, and wrote a dictionary of religions, relies heavily on Broughton. I mean, she footnotes Broughton all over the place, but what she says is, the English only went this far, we Americans went all the way for religious liberty. She just thought that, America was the greatest thing in the world. And so she just exults in religious liberty and freedom, kind of overdoes it. But one of the things she does is she marginalizes indigenous Americans very much. She says they will soon be extinct. And the political reason for that, of course, is that now, when she writes this, which is like 1791, America's facing westward. and looking upon indigenous lands and territories and thinking about the extinction of those people as part of the American project. Yeah. Another question, please.
Thank you. That was really very interesting. I don't know if you agree with me. One of my notions is that the Northern European countries that embrace Protestantism commercially it was very viable for them because they were not hamstrung by the shadow of the Pope and Catholicism, and hence could advance more rapidly commercially and build greater wealth, etc., etc. And I think that that was one of the major driving forces behind that move. I mean, apart from Henry VIII and his 6 wives. Would you agree with that? Or?
I would agree that Protestantism had an appeal to commercially minded mobile people.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'm thinking more that they weren't under the shadow.
Well, yes, absolutely.
I mean, if you're in France or if you're in Italy or if you're in Spain, no matter what you do, there is another guy out there with the last say in your direction, your economy,
Right.
so on and so forth.
Right.
And I think the same goes for Latin America or North America as well.
Yes, I would agree with that. The sense is that the nations that went Protestant were, historians have written about many things. The appeal to not being under the power of the prelates in Rome, the sense of political autonomy, the sense of commercial possibility, the sense of mobility, social mobility as well as commercial mobility. That's part of the appeal, but also there have been a lot of historians of the Reformation who write about the appeal of the Protestant message to sort of get us away from material factors, that it was a heavy duty to be a heaven-bound Catholic. You really bore a heavy load, whereas in Protestantism there seemed to be a lighter load being borne because of its teaching about faith and trust rather than merit and things like that. It's both.
Well, one more point. There's a great book for anybody interested in that period called Act of Oblivion. It's a novel that is based on fact, and there were 57 people that signed the death warrant for Charles I. And when Charles II came along, he made it a point to track down and execute these 57 people. 2 of them escaped to America and lived in Hadley, down near Amherst. And that they were held up in the vicar's lodgings. Nobody in the town knew they were there. And when King Philip, the Indians attacked, this one, he came out of hiding and took the town together and defended it and fought off King Philip. And is known as the Angel of Hadley because he went back into the house and nobody knew who he was or where he went. It's kind of a fascinating book.
It's a great story.
Get it at North Shore. Act of Oblivion by Robert Harris.
I thought there was someone else back here, around here.
Question here? Right here. Thanks. Could you describe a little bit, explain a little bit more the mid-right section? There's a book that's open, and above that there's a guy with a big black hat.
Yes.
And I can't make out the detail of that book.
All right. So you see the guy with the big black hat? Jesuit. power-hungry Jesuits. What he's doing is he has in his right hand, if you read it, it would be the decree that a papal decree that excommunicated the Jansenists, these French Catholics who were kind of Protestant-y oriented. You know, they didn't like the Pope so much. I mean, they didn't denounce him, and they taught Protestant things about faith and God and things like that. So the Jesuit is grabbing the arm of a French bishop who is, the likeness of the French bishop is someone who's trying to protect the Jansenists. And to the right of the French bishop, on the very edge, you would recognize that face is one of the Jansenist leaders. Right? So that's what's that part. Underneath the black hat guy is the conciliar decrees of the papacy. So beyond the Bible to the decrees of the papacy that outlawed Protestantism, that outlawed Jansenism. That is above that is a woman in a tiara, the papal tiara representing the Roman Catholic Church. And she is holding out an olive branch to the Protestant side if they embrace papal teaching, if they embrace the decrees of the councils. But interestingly enough, beneath the foot of that woman, do you see what I'm talking about? The papal chair all the way down, her foot is stepping on an image that represents empire. It's an image for the Holy Roman Empire. It's the Roman Church taking control over politics. The empire is handing to her the orb of sovereignty. So it's this mixture of religion and politics that Bernard and Picard are going against. And beneath the woman's right foot, can you see that? So beneath her left foot is empire. Beneath her right foot, do you see what it is? It's a rabbi with a scroll of the Torah. The Torah, teaching, morality, reasonableness, learnedness, that's legitimate stuff. But the Roman Catholic Church is oppressing it. That answer your question? Yeah. I could, this is one of my favorite images. That's why it's on the cover of the book. Anybody else?
Can I just ask a question?
Hold on one sec. We want this on record.
Sorry. Yeah, I can understand this, but I still what eludes me is what triggered in the United States this move to liberty.
To liberty?
Yeah, in terms of religious liberty. I mean, certainly I can see the reasons. I mean, Catholicism was the total reverse. I mean, I thought the original founding fathers were persecuted, if you like, Protestants that were trying to get away from them rather than for a variety of reasons. But this move towards more liberty, what triggered that? What was behind that?
Well, the theory had been there. It had been the theory of religious liberty had been an English political thought and therefore received by American thinkers before the Revolution, had been in there since the end of the war, the so-called wars of religion in Europe. So it had been on the books for a long time. The question is what gives it its strength and its power so that it is eventually encoded in the Bill of Rights, the first amendment to the Constitution, right? So that has to do, again, I think in political terms, I mean, I also think in theological terms, but somehow my historical explanations begin with political stuff. And in this case, the political reasons for the First Amendment were that it was a religiously pluralistic set of fragile new states who had a very diverse population, unlike England at the start of all of this. Very diverse population. In order for it to work, there had to be drawing people in to alliance with Congress. So that, to me, helps explain the fervor for religious liberty. There was also, people have also written back the fact that in America, if you were not part of the religious majority and you felt endangered, you could always move to the next county. And if not that, then the next county. And if not that, no county. There's always, so the sense of which there's different explanations, political explanations, Enlightenment philosophy explanations, or the simple fact of land, territory, space, if you will.
So I guess that's it. I want to thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks for being here.